So, as we are in Geneva, I will say bonjour à toutes et à tous. If I ask you to think about someone who goes to the Sudanese wilderness or the Iraqi mountains to negotiate with leaders of armed groups, what would that person look like? The person you would think of would certainly not look like me, a woman, a mother of 6 children, a grandmother of 9 grandsons. Well, you would be wrong. Negotiating with leaders of armed groups is exactly what I have dedicated my life to, along with 20 colleagues all around the world. Negotiating humanitarian agreements with armed groups to better protect civilians. For instance, the demobilization of child soldiers, or the prohibition of sexual violence. But why such an initiative is necessary? Today's conflicts are no more between states, they are between states and armed groups on the other side. And whether one likes this armed group or doesn't like them, they are part of the problem, so they will be part of the solution. And whatever you call them, liberation movement, guerrillas, terrorists, they are there. And they are active. This would not be such a big deal if they didn't have any power. But the facts show us they control or they have military operation in huge areas where civilian populations live. And their behavior during the war can have an impact on millions of human beings. This is why nobody has the right to reject this conclusion. This is necessary to speak to armed groups on humanitarian issues. So, an organization with such a crazy idea, what and how was born this idea? Going to negotiate with armed groups considered to be against any discussion, any negotiation, seen as incapable of respecting commitments, labeled as terrorists. How was that idea born? In 1997, the Ottawa Convention banning anti-personnel mines was signed, and thanks to this convention, governmental armed forces would no longer use anti-personnel mines. However, this weapon will still be used by armed groups, since they cannot sign international treaties. So the question was, how can we also encourage these armed groups to ban anti-personnel mines? This weapon, which kills and mutilates more civilians than combatants. This is this concrete question that gave birth to the organization Geneva Call. The challenge was considerable. The idea of inviting armed groups to sign formal commitments and then to help them in the implementation of their obligation was new, unique, provocative, to the point where, at the beginning, we were called the UFO of the humanitarian world, and we took this as a compliment. But hundreds of hours of negotiation, and tens and dozens of missions in the middle of the desert or the jungle of countries at war, and thousands of different approaches led to 43 armed groups having signed a deed of commitment banning anti-personnel mines. But in reality, what does a signature on a piece of paper change? If respected, it changes everything. The civilian population can once again grow crops in the field, go to gather firewood, have a supply of water, resume a normal life without the threat or the risk of seeing their lives ripped apart by stepping on a landmine. But the action of our armed groups are not limited to the use of anti-personnel mines, and we understood that to better protect civilians, we had to widen our negotiation on other problems, such as the protection of children in the middle of a conflict, the use of child soldiers, the rape as a method of war, attacks on schools, on hospitals. Today, our negotiations include all these issues. At this point of my presentation, you must be asking yourself, does it work? And are we open to talking to everyone? My answers are yes and yes. Yes, it works. And yes, we have to be open to talking to everyone. If one only wants to speak to the good guys, the civilians' fate will not improve. This is precisely with the bad guys that we have to try to negotiate, so they can change their behavior. To give you a slightly more concrete idea, I brought with me today some stones and 3 guests. Don't be scared, I will not throw these stones at you. No, each stone has a story, each stone has a face. And every time I go in a country at war to negotiate, I bring back a stone from this region, from a place where men, women, and children are suffering, a place that I was able to leave, but they had to remain in the middle of the war. My first guest is Aleu. Aleu lives in an African country which is fighting war for more than 50 years. The one constant is the suffering of the population. I brought back this stone from these countries, this stone with Aleu's face, burned by the sun. Aleu was 6 years old when he stepped on a landmine and lost his leg. The rebels who control this region don't have the medical capacity to fit him with the prosthetic leg. We have negotiated with these rebels. We have explained them the necessity of letting specialized humanitarian organizations have access. Rebels are sometimes suspicious about humanitarian organizations as they are nervous about the fact they may be spies serving the enemy. Today, where Aleu lives, and after our efforts, the rebels have accepted that specialized humanitarian organizations come to take care of the numerous landmine victims, and Aleu can play again football. My second guest is Rania. Rania lives in the Middle East, and I brought back this stone from this region where war is raging. Rania is part of a group of 150 child soldiers who we were able to demobilize. Through Rania, I learned that many teenager girls choose to join an armed group not because their biggest dream is to have a Kalashnikov, but because they are running away from their families where forced marriage is on the horizon. They choose to be a fighter rather to be a sexual object. It took time to negotiate with this armed group. It meant going on location. You cannot negotiate by Skype or by Facebook message, clicking like. No. You have to spend time with them. You have to sit down with them. You have to understand their motivation, their way of operating, their religion. And most of all, you have to understand the reality that surrounds them. You will never be able to negotiate with armed groups if you don't understand their constraints. Finally, the armed group where Rania lives agreed to demobilize these child soldiers and to offer them protection and shelter. They have created adequate centers for them. The negotiation paid off. Now, I would like to introduce you to Santiago, a Latin American rebel leader. This tone still radiates the softness of that music's country. Santiago's armed group is listed as a terrorist group. Does it mean that we have to turn our back on him? No, on the contrary. The more we demonize people, the harder they will become. Blindly leading military operation, killing both civilians, combatants, indifferently. We have been negotiated with Santiago's armed group for more than 10 years. Very difficult negotiations. One day, Santiago told us, every one of us went to war on the premise of fighting for humanity. But in the process, we have ended up destroying it. Once we heard that, we understood that to negotiate with them, we had to reach back their basic values, their ideal of fighting for humanity. And then Santiago told us, with you, this is the first time that someone has come to talk to us about improving our behavior rather than just to get us to lay down our weapons. They fight war. Whether we like it or not, this is what they have decided. And the morality to tell them, make love, not war, or the threat to put them on a list of terrorists, will not make them decide to lay down their weapons. On the other hand, negotiating agreements for humanitarian purposes has been possible with this armed group. I will give you an example. Santiago used to tell us that his group would never ban anti-personnel mines, as this weapon was essential to their military tactics. But one day, we confronted them with their contradiction. Using anti-personnel mines and fighting for humanity don't go together. Imagine a few isolated villages in the mountains. Everything and everyone has to travel on the one single road which connects these villages to the town. But the rebels had mined this road. It meant that no one could go to school, no one could go to the hospital, no one could sell the vegetables at the market. The life and the economy of the whole area were collapsing. With the strong support of local organizations, a humanitarian agreement was negotiated with this group, and they accepted to demine the road. One day, the road was reopened. And imagine, after months of survival in a virtual prison, what it meant for the inhabitants of this region. The priest reopened the road with all the communities behind him, celebrating a new life. We have been negotiating for several years all around the world. Today, several dozens of humanitarian agreements have been signed by armed groups and mostly respected. The communities that Aleu, Rania, Santiago, and others live in can attest that each agreement, even a small one, is a step towards reducing the suffering for the civilian population and proves that negotiating with everyone is a humanitarian imperative. Thank you.